the grandchild who devoured their grandmother. Summary. In the remote village of MinThy, Vincent, a drifter running from his past, seeks refuge with an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Howard, and their granddaughter Emily. Beneath their seemingly quiet lives lies a haunting truth. Emily harbors a dangerous connection to an ancient cursed tree in the nearby woods, a relic that holds the spirits of the vengeful dead. One night, Vincent discovers Emily performing a ritual that unleashes these spirits, threatening the entire village. As chaos erupts, Vincent teams up with the Howards to confront the curse. Emily's innocence becomes a battleground for forces beyond comprehension, as her grief over her lost parents serves as a gateway for the spirits. The Howards, armed with ancient knowledge and sheer determination, fight to seal the curse once more. In a final harrowing confrontation, the spirits are driven back into the earth, but the cost is high. The truth about the curse's origin and its unrelenting grip leaves Vincent and the Howards forever vigilant. The tree may be dormant, but its sinister presence lingers, a reminder that some evils are never truly vanquished. Together, they guard the secret, knowing the battle could begin anew at any time. Part 1. A Stranger's Refuge. Vincent stumbled through the thick underbrush, his breath ragged, his clothes torn and stained with mud. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dense forest that surrounded him. Each crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made him flinch, his nerves frayed from days of relentless travel and the memories of what he'd left behind. The village of MinThy appeared like a mirage through the trees, its scattered lights a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. He reached the edge of the village just as his legs gave out, collapsing onto the dirt road. Villagers approached cautiously, their faces etched with curiosity and a hint of suspicion. A man with a weathered face and steady eyes stepped forward. "Are you lost, son?" he asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Vincent the drifter croaked, his voice barely audible. "I need shelter." The man, who introduced himself as Mr. Howard, exchanged a look with a gray-haired woman who emerged from the crowd. "Bring him inside," she said, her voice soft but decisive. Together, they helped Vincent into their modest home on the outskirts of the village. The warmth of the fire inside was a sharp contrast to the chill of the night. Mrs. Howard, bustling about the small kitchen, handed Vincent a bowl of steaming soup. "Eat," she urged, her sharp eyes scanning his haggard form. "You look like you've been through hell." Vincent muttered his thanks and ate greedily, the food restoring some strength to his battered body. As he ate, he noticed a girl sitting quietly in the corner. She couldn't have been more than 12, her pale face framed by dark, tangled hair. Her large eyes locked onto his with an unsettling intensity. "That's Emily, our granddaughter," Mrs. Howard said, noticing Vincent's gaze. "She's shy." Vincent nodded, though he felt there was more to Emily's silence than shyness. There was something in her eyes, a depth of sorrow and unease that seemed far too heavy for someone her age. Over the next few days, Vincent settled into a routine. He helped Mr. Howard with odd jobs around the house and the surrounding farmland. The work was hard but honest, and for a time, it dulled the edge of his thoughts. Yet the sense of unease that had greeted him upon his arrival never fully dissipated. At night, the village seemed to change. The cheerful chatter of the day gave way to an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the whisper of the wind through the trees. Vincent often found himself staring out the window of the barn where he slept, his heart racing at shadows that seemed to move just beyond the edge of the light. Emily's behavior only added to his growing discomfort. She disappeared for hours at a time, always returning with muddy feet and a faraway look in her eyes. Once, Vincent tried to follow her, but she vanished into the dense woods before he could catch up. When he mentioned it to Mr. Howard, the old man's expression darkened. "Don't pry," he warned. "Emily's been through a lot. Let her be." One night, Vincent awoke to the sound of soft footsteps outside the barn. Peering through the small window, he saw Emily walking toward the woods, a lantern in her hand. Against his better judgment, he decided to follow her. The forest was alive with sounds: the creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, and an eerie whispering that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Emily led him to a clearing dominated by a massive, twisted tree. Its gnarled branches clawed at the sky, and the air around it felt heavy, oppressive. Emily knelt at its base, her hands pressed to the ground as she murmured words Vincent couldn't understand. Suddenly, the earth beneath her hands began to move, and Vincent watched in horror as skeletal hands clawed their way to the surface. He stumbled back, a sharp snap of a twig betraying his presence. Emily's head whipped around, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice layered with an unnatural resonance. The ground around the tree erupted as more figures began to rise, their gaunt faces twisted in expressions of pain and rage. The whispers in the air grew louder, a cacophony of despair that threatened to drown out Vincent's thoughts. He turned and ran, the cries of the dead echoing behind him. Back at the house, Vincent burst through the door, his chest heaving. The woods. Emily. The tree, he gasped. Mr. Howard's face turned ashen. "It's too late," he muttered, grabbing a wooden staff from the corner of the room. Their awake Mrs. Howard lit a series of candles and began chanting under her breath, her hands trembling. "We'll need to hold them off until dawn," she said. "Vincent, stay close." The hours that followed were a blur of chaos and terror. The spirits attacked in waves, their forms flickering between the corporeal and the ethereal. Mr. Howard's chants and the flickering candlelight seemed to keep them at bay. But each assault left the house more battered, the air inside thick with fear. When the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the spirits retreated, their anguished cries fading into the distance. The Howards slumped in exhaustion, their faces etched with grief. "What was that?" Vincent demanded. Mr. Howard looked at him with haunted eyes. "The curse," he said simply. "And now it's up to us to contain it." The days that followed were filled with tension and whispered fears. Vincent pressed Mr. Howard for answers, but the old man was reluctant to share details. "Some things are better left unsaid," he muttered. But Vincent's curiosity burned. He began to explore the village, speaking with the few residents brave enough to talk about the tree. "It's cursed," one old woman whispered, her voice trembling. "The spirits of the wronged are bound to it. They were buried there long ago, their anger festering beneath the roots." Vincent pieced together fragments of the story. The tree had once been the site of a great injustice, a massacre during a time of war. The villagers had tried to forget, to bury the guilt alongside the bodies. But the earth doesn't forget, and neither do the dead. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Vincent found Emily sitting alone in the barn. Her small frame seemed even smaller, hunched over with her knees drawn to her chest. "Emily," he began softly, sitting down beside her. "Why do you go to the tree?" She didn't look at him. "They called to me," she said simply. "Who?" Vincent pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ones beneath," she replied, her voice distant. "They're sad. They're angry. They want someone to hear them." Vincent felt a chill crawl up his spine. "And do you hear them?" "I mean," Emily finally turned to him, her eyes wide and filled with tears. "I wish I didn't." That night, Vincent couldn't sleep. The weight of what Emily had said bore down on him, and he found himself staring out the barn window, watching the shadows stretch and dance. The tree loomed in his mind, its twisted branches a dark silhouette against the starry sky. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were plagued by images of the spirits, their gaunt faces and hollow eyes, their cries for vengeance. He woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat. The faint glow of dawn was breaking, but Vincent knew that the darkness was far from over. The curse was alive, and it was hungry. Part 2. The Quiet Watcher. Emily's behavior was a puzzle Vincent couldn't solve, a series of disjointed pieces that refused to fit together. She moved like a ghost through the house, her presence almost imperceptible save for the faint creak of floorboards, or the flicker of her dark eyes watching him from across the rook cross. Her silence gnawed at him, especially when paired with her habit of vanishing into the woods without a word. The first time he saw her return from one of these excursions, her bare feet caked in mud and her dress streaked with dirt, he asked her where she'd been. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable, before disappearing into her room without a sound. He brought it up to Mrs. Howard later that evening. "She goes into the woods a lot," he said cautiously, not wanting to overstep. "Is she all right?" Mrs. Howard's hands froze mid-stitch, her needle hovering over the fabric in her lap. "Emily's a sensitive child," she said after a long pause. "She finds comfort in the trees. Let her be." But it didn't feel like comfort to Vincent. The way she carried herself after returning from the forest, her shoulders hunched, her eyes vacant, spoke more of a burden than solace. At night, the house was unnervingly quiet, save for the faint whispers that seemed to drift in through the windows. Vincent often lay awake in the barn, his mind racing as he tried to convince himself the sounds were nothing more than the wind or the creak of old wood. But the whispers carried a tone he couldn't ignore, low and mournful, with an edge of despair that left him feeling as though the house itself was grieving. One evening, as Vincent was closing the barn door for the night, he caught sight of Emily slipping into the woods again. Her lantern's glow bobbed faintly in the darkness, and before he could second-guess himself, Vincent grabbed his coat and followed. The air in the forest was heavy, oppressive, as if the trees themselves were watching. Vincent kept his distance, careful not to let the light of her lantern reveal him. Emily moved with purpose, her small figure weaving through the undergrowth with an ease that suggested familiarity. As they ventured deeper, the forest seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air grew colder, and the faint whispers Vincent had heard from the barn grew louder, more distinct. He strained to make out the words, but they were just out of reach, a tangled murmur that sent shivers down his spine. Emily stopped in a clearing dominated by an enormous tree. Its twisted branches clawed at the sky, and its trunk was so wide that it seemed to pulse with life. Vincent held his breath as he watched her kneel at the base of the tree, her lantern casting an eerie glow on the ground. She began to speak, her voice soft but steady, her words in a language Vincent didn't recognize. The earth beneath her hands began to move. At first it was a subtle shift, as though the ground were breathing. But then, to Vincent's horror, skeletal hands began to claw their way to the surface. He stumbled back, a gasp escaping him before he could stop it. Emily's head snapped around, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice layered with an unnatural resonance. The whispers around them grew into a cacophony, the air thick with their despair. Vincent turned and ran, the sound of cracking bones and anguished cries chasing him through the forest. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the woods, his chest heaving, his mind racing with questions he didn't want answered. The next morning, Vincent found Mr. Howard in the yard, sharpening a blade. "I saw Emily in the woods last night," he began, his voice hesitant. "There's something out there. Something." "Wrong." Mr. Howard's hand stilled, his knuckles white against the handle of the blade. "You need to stay away from the woods," he said firmly. "And from Emily when she's there." "But why?" Vincent pressed. "What's happening to her?" The old man's eyes met his, dark and unyielding. "Some questions are better left unanswered, son. For your sake, leave it be." Despite the warning, Vincent couldn't shake the image of Emily at the tree. The memory clung to him like a shadow, growing darker with each passing day. The whispers that had once been confined to the forest now seemed to follow him everywhere, their mournful tones creeping into his thoughts even in the light of day. Emily's behavior became more erratic. She would stare out the window for hours, her lips moving as though in conversation with someone unseen. When Vincent tried to engage her, she barely responded, her eyes glazed over with an otherworldly detachment. One night, as the whispers grew louder than ever, Vincent resolved to confront her. He found her in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, with her back to him. Her hair hung in damp strands, and the faint scent of earth clung to her. "Emily," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "What's happening to you?" She turned to him slowly, her eyes filled with tears. "They're calling for me," she whispered. "I can't ignore them." "Who's calling?" Vincent asked, his voice trembling. Emily's gaze shifted to the window. "The ones beneath. They're so sad. And so angry." Vincent's breath caught in his throat. "Emily, you don't have to listen to them. Whatever they are, they're not your responsibility." "But they are," she said, her voice breaking. "They've been waiting for so long. And now they found me." Vincent barely slept that night, the weight of Emily's words pressing down on him like a physical force. He lay awake in the barn, staring at the rafters as the whispers grew louder, their tones shifting from mournful to menacing. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were plagued by images of the tree, its branches twisting and writhing like living things. He woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat. The first light of dawn was breaking, but the darkness inside him lingered. Whatever was happening to Emily, it was far from over, and Vincent knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The forest was calling, and he would have to face it even if it meant confronting the horrors that lurked within. Part 3. The Cursed Tree. Vincent's unease deepened with each passing day. Emily's behavior had gone beyond peculiar, it bordered on otherworldly. She moved through the house like a shadow, her eyes heavy with a secret too large for her small frame. Vincent had tried to dismiss the strange occurrences, to focus on the chores Mr. Howard assigned him, but the whispers, those haunting, disembodied whispers, kept pulling him back to the woods. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, he saw Emily take her lantern and slip silently into the forest. Her movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. Against his better judgment, Vincent followed her. The forest felt alive, but not in the comforting way of rustling leaves and chirping crickets. The trees seemed to lean in toward him, their gnarled branches casting grotesque shadows in the dim lantern light. The whispers that had plagued his nights grew louder, forming faint words he couldn't quite grasp. Vincent kept his distance, his heart pounding as he followed Emily deeper into the woods. She led him to a clearing dominated by an enormous ancient tree. Its trunk was twisted, its roots sprawling across the ground like skeletal fingers. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, and something metallic like blood. Emily knelt at the base of the tree, setting her lantern down. She began to speak, her voice soft but firm, the words in a language Vincent didn't recognize. He watched, frozen, as the ground beneath Emily's hands began to shift. It started as a subtle tremor, but soon the earth broke open, and skeletal hands emerged, clawing at the air. The sight was so horrifying that Vincent stumbled backward, snapping a twig underfoot. The sound echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. Emily's head snapped up. Her eyes glowed faintly in the lantern light, and her voice layered otherworldly sent chills down Vincent's spine. "You shouldn't be here," she said. The skeletal hands continued to claw their way free, and now faces began to emerge from the ground. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, their mouths opened in silent screams. The whispers had turned into a cacophony, a symphony of anguish that seemed to press down on Vincent from all sides. He wanted to move, to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. Suddenly, one of the figures lunged toward him, its bony hand outstretched. The movement snapped Vincent out of his paralysis, and he turned and fled. The forest seemed alive around him, branches clawing at his clothes, roots twisting underfoot to trip him. Behind him, the cries of the spirits grew louder, their rage palpable. Vincent burst into the Howard's house, his chest heaving. Mrs. Howard stood in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn as she took in his disheveled state. "The tree," he gasped. "Emily. She's..." There's something. Mr. Howard appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. He grabbed Vincent by the shoulders, steadying him. "What did you see?" the tree, Vincent repeated, his voice shaking. "There are things under it, things that shouldn't be." Mr. Howard let out a heavy sigh and released Vincent. "It's begun," he muttered, his voice tinged with resignation. "What's begun?" Vincent demanded. "What the hell is happening?" Mrs. Howard set down the pot she was holding with trembling hands. "The curse," she said simply. Over cups of strong, bitter tea, the Howards told Vincent the story of the tree. Generations ago, the land where Van Dyne now stood had been the site of a massacre. Soldiers, fueled by greed and hatred, had slaughtered an entire village. The survivors' women, children, the elderly had been buried in a mass grave beneath the tree. But the spirits of the dead did not rest. Their anger and pain seeped into the roots, twisting the tree into a conduit for their rage. Every so often, Mr. Howard explained, someone hears the whispers. Someone sensitive. And when that happens, he trailed off, his gaze heavy on Vincent. "The spirits awakened," Mrs. Howard finished, her voice trembling. and they demand to be heard. Vincent's stomach turned. And Emily? Why? Mr. Howard shook his head. We don't know. But she's drawn to it. They've chosen her. The days that followed were a blur of fear and preparation. Mr. Howard began carving strange symbols into wooden planks, while Mrs. Howard gathered herbs and candles. Vincent helped where he could, though he didn't understand half of what they were doing. The whispers grew louder with each passing night, and Emily's behavior became more erratic. She would disappear for hours, returning with dirt under her nails and a faraway look in her eyes. One night, as the Howards worked in the kitchen, Vincent found Emily sitting by the window, staring out at the forest. Emily, he said softly, sitting beside her. What's happening to you? She didn't look at him. They're angry, she whispered. They want me to fix it. Fix what? Vincent pressed, his voice gentle. Emily finally turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears. What happened to them? What was done to them? They're in so much pain. Before Vincent could respond, a loud crash came from the kitchen. He rushed in to find Mr. Howard on the floor, his tools scattered around him. It's too late, the old man said, his voice trembling. They're coming. The first attack came just before dawn. The spirits emerged from the woods like a tidal wave of darkness, their gaunt faces twisted with rage. The Howards had prepared for this, their home fortified with wards and protective symbols, but it was barely enough. The spirits slammed against the barriers, their cries shaking the very walls. Emily stood in the center of the room, her face pale but calm. She raised her hands, her lips moving in that strange, otherworldly language. The spirits hesitated, their movements faltering, but then surged forward with renewed fury. Vincent grabbed her by the shoulders. Emily, stop. You're only making it worse. She looked at him, tears streaming down her face. I have to try, she said. The room shook as the spirits' cries reached a deafening pitch. Mr. Howard shouted an incantation, and the wards flared with light, pushing the spirits back. But Vincent knew it was only a matter of time before the barriers failed. We have to end this, he said, his voice firm. At the tree. That's where it started. And that's where it has to end. Mr. Howard nodded grimly. Then we go at first light. Part 4. The Unleashing. The spirits descended on Van Dye like a living nightmare. They came with the wind, their twisted forms flickering in and out of sight, as though caught between this world and the next. The first to notice were the dogs, their howls slicing through the early evening calm. Then came the screams, villagers running through the narrow streets, pursued by shapes that seemed to melt into the shadows. Vincent stood at the Howard's kitchen window, his hands gripping the wooden frame so tightly that splinters bit into his palms. He saw a woman stumble into the village square, clutching her child. Behind her, a gaunt figure emerged from the shadows. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly as it reached out with skeletal fingers. Before Vincent could cry out, the figure engulfed her in a swirl of darkness, leaving nothing but silence. They've broken through, Mr. Howard said grimly, snapping Vincent's attention back to the room. He was hurriedly drawing symbols on the walls with a piece of chalk, his hands steady despite the chaos outside. Mrs. Howard stood beside him, clutching a bundle of herbs tied with red string. How do we stop them? Vincent demanded. His voice trembled, but his resolve held. He had seen enough to know that running wasn't an option. We can't stop them, Mr. Howard said, his voice heavy with resignation. Not completely. But we can hold them off long enough to protect Emily. The attack on the house began shortly after sunset. The first sign was the cold. It seeped into the room like a living thing, extinguishing the fire in the hearth and frosting the edges of the windows. Then came the whispers, growing louder until they became wails that shook the walls. The Howard's wards flared to life, their glowing symbols casting flickering light across the room. Vincent stood at the center of the house, holding a crude wooden staff Mr. Howard had thrust into his hands. The staff was carved with the same symbols that adorned the walls, its surface rough and splintered. Stay close to the girl, Mr. Howard ordered. No matter what happens, do not let them take her. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, her face pale but eerily calm. Her eyes were fixed on the door, as if she could see the horrors waiting outside. The first spirit breached the barrier with a deafening shriek. It burst through the door in a swirl of black smoke, its form coalescing into a figure that was almost human. Its face was a twisted mask of rage, its mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. Vincent swung the staff instinctively, and the spirit recoiled, hissing as the symbols flared with light. "Hold the line," Mr. Howard shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony. He stood near the fireplace, chanting in a guttural language that made the air vibrate. The wards on the walls pulsed in response, pushing back the encroaching darkness. But the spirits kept coming. They poured through the windows and walls, their forms shifting and writhing. Some were skeletal, their bones clattering as they moved. Others were little more than shadows, their edges fraying like smoke. One lunged at Mrs. Howard, its clawed hand reaching for her throat. She swung her bundle of herbs, and the spirit disintegrated with a shriek. As the battle raged, Vincent saw Emily rise to her feet. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear over the din. The air around her shimmered, and the spirits seemed to falter, their movements slowing. "What is she doing?" Vincent shouted, his voice hoarse. "She's drawing them to her," Mrs. Howard cried, panic flashing in her eyes. Emily stopped, but Emily didn't stop. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her voice grew louder, cutting through the chaos. The spirits turned toward her, their forms converging like a tide drawn to the moon. Vincent's heart clenched as he realized what was happening. "She's trying to save us," he whispered. The spirits surged forward, their cries reaching a deafening pitch. Vincent lunged toward Emily, grabbing her shoulders and shaking her. "Emily, you have to stop," he pleaded. Her eyes met his, and for a moment they were clear. "They won't stop," she said softly. "Not until it's finished." Before Vincent could respond, Mr. Howard's voice boomed across the room. "Get her out of here," he shouted, his hands glowing with light as he held the spirits at bay. Vincent didn't hesitate. He scooped Emily into his arms and bolted toward the back door. Mrs. Howard followed, her bundle of herbs held high as she chanted a prayer for protection. The spirits clawed at the air around them, their cries fading as the wards reactivated, sealing the house behind them. They ran through the village, dodging fallen lanterns and overturned carts. The streets were empty, the villagers having fled to the outskirts or worse. The few who hadn't escaped lay crumpled on the ground, their faces pale and lifeless. Vincent forced himself to look away, focusing on the path ahead. They reached a small chapel on the edge of the village, its doors hanging askew. Inside, the air was thick with incense, and the faint glow of candles cast dancing shadows on the walls. Vincent set Emily down on a pew, his arms trembling from the exertion. Mr. and Mrs. Howard arrived moments later, their faces etched with exhaustion. "This won't hold them for long," Mr. Howard said, his voice grim. "The wards are weakening. What do we do?" Vincent asked, his voice shaking. Mr. Howard met his gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sorrow. "We end this," he said. At the tree, the journey back to the tree felt like a march toward death. The forest was alive with whispers, the trees bending as if bowing to some unseen force. Emily walked between Vincent and Mr. Howard, her small hands clutching a lantern. Despite the terror, her expression was calm, almost serene. When they reached the clearing, the tree loomed before them, its twisted branches writhing as though alive. The ground around it was littered with bones, their surfaces glowing faintly in the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the whispers grew to a crescendo, drowning out all other sound. Mr. Howard stepped forward, his staff held high. "This ends tonight," he declared. The spirits surged from the ground, their forms swirling around the tree like a cyclone. Vincent tightened his grip on the staff, his heart pounding. Together, they faced the storm, determined to break the curse before it consumed them all. Part 5. The family's burden. The glow of the moonlight filtered through the cracked windows of the small chapel, casting long shadows on the walls. Vincent's breath came in shallow gasps as he leaned against a pew, trying to calm the tremor in his hands. Emily sat beside him, her small frame hunched, her hands clutching the edge of the bench. Her face was pale, but her eyes glimmered with a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. "You need to understand, Mr. Howard said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, weighted by years of secrets. He paced slowly, his staff tapping the stone floor with every step. This curse is older than any of us. Our family, my father, his father before him, has borne its weight for generations. Vincent frowned. What does that have to do with Emily? Mrs. Howard, who had been lighting candles at the altar, turned to face them. Her expression was one of sorrow and resolve. She is the reason it's awake now, she said softly. And she is the only one who can end it. The Howard story unfolded like a tapestry, each thread woven with pain and sacrifice. Long ago, a massacre had taken place in the forest where the twisted tree now stood. Innocent villagers were slaughtered in a violent act of greed and power. Their bodies were buried in a mass grave, their spirits restless and vengeful. Over time, their anguish seeped into the roots of the great tree, transforming it into a conduit for their rage. The spirits don't just haunt the land, Mr. Howard explained. They seek out those who can hear them, who can feel their pain. People like Emily. Vincent's gaze shifted to the girl. She sat silently, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the wooden bench. Why her? He asked. Mrs. Howard's voice cracked as she answered. Her parents, our daughter and son-in-law, died in an accident not long ago. Emily hasn't been the same since. Her grief. It's made her vulnerable. The spirits sensed it, and they latched onto her. Emily looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. They talk to me, she whispered. They're so sad, so angry. They tell me they want to be free. Vincent felt a chill run down his spine. And what happens if they're not freed? Mr. Howard's face darkened. They won't stop until they've consumed everything. Everyone. The revelation settled over them like a heavy shroud. Vincent stared at the flickering candles, their light dancing across the chapel walls. So what do we do? He asked finally. Mrs. Howard stepped forward, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. The spirits are tied to the tree. If we can sever their connection, we can weaken them enough to seal them away. But it won't be easy. The ritual requires Emily's participation, no, Vincent said immediately, shaking his head. She's just a child. There has to be another way. There isn't, Mr. Howard said firmly. We've tried before. The spirits need her, because they chose her. If she refuses, the curse will only grow stronger. Emily's voice was steady, though small. I'll do it. Vincent knelt before her, his hands gripping hers tightly. You don't have to. This isn't your responsibility. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she looked into his eyes. It is, she said. I'm the only one who can hear them. If I don't help them, no one will. The Howards began their preparations with grim efficiency. Mr. Howard sketched a map of the clearing where the tree stood, marking the points where protective wards needed to be placed. Mrs. Howard gathered herbs, candles, and small jars filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Emily sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap as she listened to their instructions. Vincent, unable to shake his unease, paced the length of the chapel. This ritual. How dangerous is it? Mr. Howard's silence spoke volumes. But Mrs. Howard answered. The spirits won't let her go easily. They'll fight. And they'll try to use her grief against her. Vincent's fists clenched. Then I'll protect her. No matter what it takes. They set out for the tree, just before dawn. The forest shrouded in a thick mist. The air was heavy. Each step weighted with dread. Emily walked between Vincent and Mr. Howard, clutching a lantern that barely pierced the gloom. The whispers grew louder as they approached the clearing, an almost melodic cadence that sent chills down their spines. When they reached the tree, its twisted branches seemed to writhe, as though sensing their presence. The ground beneath it pulsed faintly, a sickly glow emanating from the exposed roots. Vincent tightened his grip on the staff Mr. Howard had given him, his heart pounding in his chest. We start here, Mr. Howard said, pointing to a spot near the tree's base. Vincent, you'll guard Emily while we set the wards. Whatever happens, do not let her leave the circle. Vincent nodded, positioning himself beside Emily. She looked up at him, her face pale but resolute. Thank you, she said softly. Before Vincent could respond, the ground trembled, and the whispers erupted into a deafening wail. The spirits surged from the roots of the tree, their forms writhing and shifting as they encircled the clearing. Their hollow eyes glowed with malevolent intent, and their cries were filled with anguish and fury. "Begin the chant," Mr. Howard shouted over the din. The Howards moved with practiced precision, their voices rising in unison as they recited the incantation. The wards flared to life, their symbols glowing brightly against the encroaching darkness. The spirits recoiled, hissing and shrieking as the light burned through them. Emily knelt at the center of the circle, her hands pressed to the ground. Her lips moved silently, her eyes closed as she focused on the ritual. Vincent stood over her, swinging his staff at any spirit that dared to come too close. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and every breath felt like a struggle. Suddenly, one of the spirits broke through the wards, lunging toward Emily. Vincent intercepted it, the symbols on his staff flaring brightly as he struck. The spirit dissolved with a guttural scream, but more were closing in. "Emily, hurry," he shouted, his voice hoarse. Her eyes snapped open, glowing faintly. "I'm trying," she whispered, her voice trembling. The ground beneath her hands began to glow, and the tree's branches writhed violently. The spirit's cries reached a fever pitch, their forms blurring as the ritual took hold. The Howards' voices grew louder, their chants echoing through the clearing. And then, with a blinding flash of light, everything went silent. When Vincent opened his eyes, the clearing was still. The tree stood motionless, its branches bare and lifeless. The spirits were gone, their anguished cries replaced by an eerie calm. Emily slumped forward, her small frame trembling as she gasped for air. "It's done," Mr. Howard said, his voice heavy with relief. But his expression was somber, his gaze fixed on Emily. For now Vincent knelt beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I hope they're at peace now," she whispered. As they made their way back to the village, Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't truly over. The curse might have been quieted, but the scars it left behind would never fully heal. Part 6. A plan to contain. The clearing around the chapel was thick with mist, the air heavy with a tension that had settled deep into Vincent's bones. After the night's harrowing events, silence clung to the group like a shroud. Mr. Howard's face was etched with lines of worry as he spread out a yellowed map across the altar. The map, marked with symbols Vincent couldn't decipher, seemed to hum faintly under the flickering candlelight. "We can't keep running," Mr. Howard began, his voice steady but weary. "The spirits are growing stronger. If we don't act now, there won't be anything left to save." Vincent stood at the edge of the group, his hands shoved into his pockets to stop their trembling. "You said the tree is the key," he said. "What's the plan?" Mr. Howard looked up, his gaze piercing. "We seal it. We cut off the spirit's connection to this world and lock them back into the void where they belong." Mrs. Howard placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. The girl had barely spoken since the last attack, her eyes distant and haunted. "It won't be easy," Mrs. Howard said softly. "The ritual requires precision, strength, and most of all, courage. The spirits won't let us succeed without a fight." Emily looked up, her voice small but resolute. "I'll help. I'll do whatever it takes." The plan began to take shape as Mr. Howard laid out the steps. They would need to place protective wards around the clearing to contain the spirits and focus their energy on the tree. Emily, as the spirit's chosen vessel, would serve as the anchor for the ritual. Her role was dangerous but critical. "Vincent," Mr. Howard said, turning to him, "you'll guard Emily. If anything breaks through the wards, it'll come for her first." Vincent's stomach tightened, but he nodded. "I'll protect her," he said, his voice firm despite the fear coiling in his chest. Mrs. Howard began gathering supplies from a battered chest near the altar. She handed Vincent a staff carved with intricate symbols. "This will help you fight them off," she said. "But remember, they'll use your fears against you. Stay focused." Vincent gripped the staff tightly, its weight comforting in his hands. He glanced at Emily, who was clutching a small bundle of herbs and a jar of dark liquid. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "We'll succeed," she said softly, as if trying to convince herself as much as the others. The journey to the tree began at dawn, the mist lingering in the air like a warning. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects replaced by an oppressive silence. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself were resisting their passage. As they approached the clearing, Vincent's grip on the staff tightened. The tree loomed ahead, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The air around it seemed to hum with energy, a low vibration that set his teeth on edge. "This is it," Mr. Howard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Once we start, there's no turning back." They moved quickly, placing the wards at the points Mr. Howard had marked on the map. Each ward was a small wooden totem, carved with symbols and anointed with the dark liquid from Mrs. Howard's jars. As they worked, the whispers began soft at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. "They know we're here," Mrs. Howard said, her voice trembling. "We need to hurry." The ritual began with Mr. Howard's deep, resonant chanting. The words were unfamiliar, their syllables heavy and guttural, but they carried a power that seemed to reverberate through the clearing. Mrs. Howard joined in, her voice weaving a harmony that made the wards glow faintly. Emily knelt at the base of the tree, her hands pressed to the ground. She closed her eyes, her lips moving silently as she focused her energy. Vincent stood behind her, the staff held at the ready. His heart pounded as the air grew colder, the whispers now a deafening roar. The first spirit appeared at the edge of the clearing, its form barely visible against the mist. It was joined by another, and then another, until a dozen twisted figures surrounded them. Their hollow eyes burned with malice, and their movements were jerky and unnatural, as though they were fighting against invisible chains. "Hold the line," Mr. Howard shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The spirits surged forward, their cries piercing the air. Vincent swung the staff, its symbols flaring with light as it struck the nearest spirit. The creature dissolved into smoke with a guttural shriek, but more took its place. Mrs. Howard moved to reinforce the wards, her hands shaking as she anointed them with fresh liquid. "They're testing the barrier," she called out. "Stay strong." Emily's voice broke through the cacophony, clear and steady despite the chaos around her. Her chant was different from the Howards', softer, more melodic. The spirits hesitated, their forms flickering as though caught between two worlds. "It's working," Mr. Howard said, his voice filled with urgency. "Keep going." But the spirits were relentless. One broke through the wards, lunging toward Emily with clawed hands. Vincent stepped forward, swinging the staff with all his strength. The creature screamed as it disintegrated, but its absence was quickly filled by another. "Emily!" "Faster!" Vincent shouted, his voice hoarse. The girl's chant grew louder, her eyes glowing faintly as the ground beneath her hands began to shift. The tree's branches writhed violently, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Suddenly, a deafening crack split the air. The tree's trunk glowed with an otherworldly light, and the spirits screamed as they were pulled toward it, their forms dissolving into the brightness. The wards flared one last time before shattering, their energy spent. When the light faded, the clearing was still. The tree stood motionless, its branches bare and lifeless. Emily collapsed onto the ground, her small frame trembling with exhaustion. Vincent dropped to his knees beside her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's done," Mr. Howard said, his voice heavy with relief. "The connection is severed." Mrs. Howard knelt beside Emily, cradling the girl in her arms. "You were brave," she whispered. So brave. Vincent looked around the clearing, his heart heavy despite their victory. The spirits were gone, but the air still felt charged with their presence. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind would linger. As they made their way back to the village, Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that the curse wasn't truly gone. The tree might be dormant, but its shadow remained, a silent reminder of the horrors it had unleashed. Part 7. The final confrontation. The forest swallowed the faint light of their lanterns, leaving only shadows and whispers to guide them. Each step toward the cursed tree felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself resisted their passage. Mr. Howard led the group with grim determination, the staff in his hand casting flickering symbols onto the ground. Beside him, Mrs. Howard carried a satchel filled with protective wards, her lips moving in silent prayers. Emily clutched her lantern tightly, her pale face illuminated in the faint glow, and Vincent brought up the rear, gripping his staff with white-knuckled hands. The whispers began softly, barely audible beneath the sound of their footsteps. But as they approached the clearing, they grew louder, a rising chorus of anguish and fury that seemed to emanate from the very air around them. The cursed tree loomed ahead, its twisted branches writhing as though alive, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. "This is where it ends," Mr. Howard said, his voice steady but weighted with years of responsibility. "Emily, take your position. Vincent, stay close to her." The girl nodded, her small frame trembling, but her resolve unshaken. She knelt at the base of the tree, placing her hands on the exposed roots. The air around her seemed to shift, the oppressive energy of the clearing converging on her. Vincent positioned himself behind her, his staff raised, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. The Howards began chanting, their voices weaving a melody of ancient power and defiance. The wards they had placed earlier around the clearing flared to life, forming a protective barrier of light. But the spirits were already gathering. They emerged from the shadows, their hollow eyes glowing with malevolence. Some were skeletal, their bones clattering with each step, while others were shapeless masses of darkness, their edges fraying like smoke. "They're testing the wards," Mrs. Howard said, her voice tight with tension. "We must hold them back." The spirits surged forward, slamming against the barrier with a force that shook the ground. The wards pulsed, repelling the first wave, but the energy faltered under the relentless assault. Vincent tightened his grip on his staff, his heart pounding as the first spirit broke through. It lunged at Emily, its clawed hands reaching for her. With a cry, Vincent swung his staff. The symbols etched into the wood flared brightly, and the spirit dissolved with an anguished scream. More followed, their cries a chilling symphony that echoed through the clearing. Vincent fought with a desperation he didn't know he possessed. Each swing of the staff met with resistance as though the air itself were fighting him. "They're too strong," he shouted over the din. "The wards won't hold much longer." Mr. Howard's chant grew louder, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of guardianship. "Emily, focus," he commanded. "You must complete the ritual." Emily's voice rose above the chaos, her chant soft but unyielding. Her words carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the clearing, making the spirits hesitate. For a moment, their forms flickered, caught between the physical and the ethereal. "She's holding them back," Mrs. Howard said, her tone both awed and terrified. "But she'll need more time." The spirits, enraged by Emily's defiance, redoubled their efforts. One broke through the barrier, its skeletal form glowing with an unholy light. Vincent stepped forward, meeting it with a fierce blow that shattered its fragile body. But for every spirit he destroyed, another took its place. The ground beneath them trembled, the tree's branches thrashing violently, as if in protest. The air grew colder, the whispers morphing into a deafening roar. Vincent's arms burned with exhaustion, but he refused to falter. Each swing of his staff felt heavier, as though the weight of the spirit's anguish was bearing down on him. "Emily, hurry," he shouted, his voice raw. The girl's chant grew louder, her eyes glowing faintly as she raised her hands above the roots. The ground around her began to glow, cracks forming in the earth as the tree's energy surged. The spirits screamed in unison, their forms distorting as they were drawn toward the light emanating from the tree. The final moments of the confrontation were a blur of light and sound. The wards shattered with a blinding flash, their energy spent. The spirits' cries reached a fever pitch as they were pulled into the fissures in the ground, their forms dissolving into the void. The tree's branches writhed one last time before falling still, its twisted form bathed in an eerie silence. Emily collapsed, her small frame trembling with exhaustion. Vincent dropped to his knees beside her, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The clearing was silent now, the oppressive energy that had filled the air dissipated. "It's done," Mr. Howard said, his voice heavy with relief. "The connection is severed." Mrs. Howard knelt beside Emily, cradling the girl in her arms. "You were brave," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "So brave." Vincent looked around the clearing, his heart heavy despite their victory. The spirits were gone, but the scars they had left behind would linger. The tree might have been neutralized, but its shadow remained, a silent reminder of the horrors it had unleashed. As they made their way back to the village, the group moved in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that their battle wasn't truly over. The curse might have been contained, but its echoes would haunt them for years to come. And deep in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder, had they truly won, or had they simply delayed the inevitable? Part 8. A Pyrrhic Victory. The clearing lay still, the oppressive weight of the battle giving way to an eerie silence. The tree stood motionless, its twisted branches no longer writhing but frozen in grotesque shapes, as if it were a sculpture of its own anguish. The light from the shattered wards faded, leaving the moon and stars to reclaim the night. Yet there was no peace in the stillness, only exhaustion and the unshakable sense of loss. Emily lay on the ground, her small frame trembling as she gasped for air. Her hands, scraped and bloodied, rested limply at her sides. Mrs. Howard knelt beside her, her face lined with worry and the remnants of tears. She whispered words of comfort, though her voice trembled with the weight of the ordeal. Vincent collapsed nearby, the staff slipping from his hand. His body ached in ways he couldn't describe, as though the battle had drained something deeper than his physical strength. He looked at Mr. Howard, who stood with his shoulders hunched, his staff planted firmly in the ground for support. The elder's face was pale, his eyes distant, staring at the tree, as though searching for answers among its lifeless branches. "It's over," Vincent said, his voice hoarse. But the words rang hollow, an attempt to convince himself as much as the others. The cost of their victory became clearer as they gathered themselves. Mr. Howard's hands shook as he traced the symbols on his staff, his lips moving in a silent prayer. He had aged years in a single night, the burden of his family's legacy etched into his face. Mrs. Howard, normally steadfast, wiped at her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around Emily, who had not spoken a word since the spirits were sealed. Vincent walked toward the tree, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound in the stillness. The ground around it was cracked, as though the earth itself had rebelled against what had just occurred. He reached out to touch the bark but stopped short, his hand hovering over the gnarled surface. The air around the tree felt wrong, heavy with the remnants of its curse. He stepped back, his chest tightening. "Don't," Mr. Howard said from behind him. His voice was firm, though weary. "It may be quiet now, but it's not gone. It never is." Vincent turned to face him, the weight of the man's words settling heavily. "Then what did we accomplish?" Mr. Howard's gaze softened, though his eyes remained shadowed. "We bought time. Time for the village, for Emily, for all of us. But the curse, it's a wound that can't be healed. We can only keep it at bay." They began the slow journey back to the village, each step feeling heavier than the last. Emily walked between Vincent and Mrs. Howard, her head bowed, her lantern extinguished. The path through the forest, once so oppressive, now felt hollow, as though the spirits had left a void in their absence. But Vincent knew better. The curse might have been contained, but its echoes lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the night's events. As they reached the outskirts of the village, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, casting a pale light over the quiet streets. The few villagers who emerged from their homes wore expressions of fear and exhaustion, their eyes darting toward the forest, as though expecting the spirits to return at any moment. Mr. Howard stopped to speak with them, his voice low but reassuring. "The danger has passed," he told them. For now. Back at the Howards' home, the group sat in silence around the kitchen table. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that lingered in their bones. Emily stared into the flames, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Her eyes, once so full of curiosity and life, now seemed distant, as though she were looking through the fire into another world. "She'll need time," Mrs. Howard said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but the way she clutched her teacup betrayed her unease. "We all will," Vincent nodded, though he wasn't sure time would be enough. He couldn't shake the image of Emily at the tree, her small hands pressed against its roots, her voice rising above the chaos. She had been brave, far braver than anyone her age should ever have to be. But it had cost her. Her innocence, once so vibrant, now felt like a distant memory. Over the next few days, the village tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. But the scars of the battle remained. The forest, once a source of livelihood and stories, was now avoided by all. The villagers whispered about what had happened, their words laced with fear and gratitude for the Howards and Vincent. But their gratitude did little to lighten the burden that weighed on the group. Mr. Howard spent most of his days tending to the wards around the village, reinforcing them with fresh symbols and rituals. Mrs. Howard kept close to Emily, her protective nature amplified by the girl's silence. And Vincent. Vincent found himself walking the perimeter of the forest each evening, his staff in hand, his eyes scanning the shadows. He told himself it was to ensure the curse remained contained, but deep down, he knew he was searching for something, or someone to blame for what they had endured. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Vincent found Emily sitting on the steps of the house. She looked up at him, her eyes weary but clear. "Do you think they're at peace now?" she asked softly. He hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Finally, he sat beside her, his hands resting on his knees. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think you gave him a chance, and that's more than anyone else could have done." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the forest. "I can still hear them sometimes," she said. "Not as loud as before, but they're still there." Vincent felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Then we'll keep watch," he said firmly. "We'll make sure they stay where they belong." The nights grew quieter as the weeks passed, but the weight of the curse remained. The Howards and Vincent had fought back the darkness, but it had left its mark on them all. They had won, but it was a hollow victory, a reminder that some battles can never truly be finished. And as Vincent stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the shadows, he knew one thing for certain: the curse was dormant, not defeated. And when it woke again, they would be ready. Part 9. Eternal Vigilance. The cursed tree stood silent, its grotesque branches unmoving in the dawn's pale light. Yet, even in stillness, it radiated a malevolence that made the air heavy. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed defeated, a lifeless husk, stripped of the spirits it had harbored. But Vincent knew better. The tree was not dead, it was waiting. After the battle, the Howards and Vincent had retreated to their home, each burdened with the weight of what they had witnessed. Emily's quiet resolve had been replaced with a somber stillness. She barely spoke, her once bright eyes now shadowed with memories too heavy for a child to bear. She spent her days near the hearth, staring into the flames as though searching for something lost. Vincent's decision to stay was made without hesitation. He could not leave knowing the danger might return. The Howards needed help, and the village, whether it realized it or not, needed protection. He took up residence in the small barn behind their home, transforming it into a workshop where he carved wards and studied the ancient symbols Mr. Howard had taught him. At first, the villagers were wary of him. To them, he was an outsider, a man who had stumbled into their town and faced horrors they had only heard whispered about. But as days turned to weeks, their gratitude softened their suspicion. They brought him food and supplies, though their visits were always brief, their eyes darting nervously toward the forest. The Howards had their own ways of coping. Mr. Howard threw himself into his work, spending long hours reinforcing the village's protective barriers. The symbols he carved into doorframes and fences glowed faintly at night, a reminder of the invisible shield that kept the curse at bay. Mrs. Howard remained by Emily's side, her gentle presence a balm for the girl's frayed spirit. She read stories aloud, her voice steady even when Emily didn't respond. Vincent patrolled the forest daily, his staff in hand, his senses sharp. The whispers had faded, but the forest was far from silent. He often felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him, the faint rustle of leaves hinting at movement just beyond his line of sight. Each time, he paused, gripping his staff tightly, ready for the fight that never came. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Vincent stood at the edge of the forest, his gaze fixed on the distant silhouette of the tree. He had made this walk countless times, yet the unease never faded. Tonight it felt stronger, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. "You're out late," Mr. Howard said, stepping out from the shadows. He carried his staff, the symbols etched into its surface glowing faintly in the fading light. "I couldn't sleep," Vincent replied. "Felt like something was." Watching, Mr. Howard nodded, his expression grave. "The tree may be dormant, but the curse hasn't left. It's always watching, waiting for the moment we falter." "Then we can't falter," Vincent said firmly. The elder man's gaze softened. "You've done more for this village than anyone could have asked. But you don't have to carry this burden alone." Vincent shook his head. "It's not just your fight anymore. I'm staying." The weeks turned into months, and the village began to heal, though the scars remained. The forest was avoided, its once vital trails now overgrown with weeds. The villagers planted their fields closer to the village, their lives reshaped by the invisible boundary of safety the Howards and Vincent maintained. Emily began to speak again, though her words were few and carefully chosen. She often asked Vincent to teach her how to carve the wards, her small hands clumsily mimicking his precise movements. "If they come back," she said one evening, "I want to help." Vincent's chest tightened at her words. "They won't get past us," he promised. "Not while we're here." One night, as Vincent sat alone in his workshop, he heard a faint rustling outside. Gripping his staff, he stepped into the cool night air, his eyes scanning the darkness. The whispers had returned, faint but unmistakable. He followed the sound to the edge of the forest, where the air felt heavier, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle. Standing there, he realized the whispers weren't coming from the forest but from within himself, a soft echo in the back of his mind. They weren't words but feeling: sorrow, anger, longing. The spirits were still there, bound to the tree, their presence a constant reminder of the battle they had fought. "You won't have another chance," Vincent murmured, tightening his grip on the staff. "Not while I'm here." As time passed, Vincent and the Howards settled into a rhythm. The curse remained dormant, its presence lingering like a shadow over the village. But they were vigilant. Together, they maintained the wards, trained their minds to resist the whispers, and prepared for the day the tree might stir again. For Vincent, the battle was no longer just about survival. It was a responsibility he had chosen, a purpose that had given him a place in a world he had once wandered aimlessly. He had found a family in the Howards, a reason to stand guard against the darkness. And as he stood at the edge of the forest each night, his staff glowing faintly in the moonlight, he knew one thing for certain: the curse would not defeat them. Not while they stood watch, not while they remained united in their eternal vigilance.